In 1977, Jerry Kay was 12 years old. He lived on his dad's farm, which backed up to a private acreage, which everybody called the Game Reserve, although nobody knew exactly why or how it got that name. The place was spooky, but also very interesting because of its isolation. It also featured some aspects which were very uncommon to the area. The Game Reserve is located in the state of Kansas, just about 15 miles from the Missouri border and about 30 miles south of Kansas City, Missouri. The animals which can be found in it are very basic creatures. The biggest prey animal is the white-tailed deer. There are raccoons, possums, and all the rodents common to the area. Support the theory that there might be a mountain lion living in there, but the reserve isn't that big, and if you follow scientific research, then it would say the area of the game reserve simply isn't enough acreage to support the mountain lion theory. However, that said, there is something in there which is bigger than any mountain lion. Jerry found out one fall afternoon when he was hunting for rabbit. It was an uncommonly warm day, which would turn out to be just one of many, as that year they would experience an Indian summer which would carry on long enough that Jerry's grandfather still had tomatoes going into November. When Jerry didn't see any game when he entered the reserve, the strangeness of the day had not yet registered with him. He should have noticed it strange there were no animals moving about. Usually you couldn't walk through any of the meadows without flushing some whitetails, a rabbit or two, and a covey of quail might jump up. The place was also visited by meadowlarks, robins, and there were even a bunch of blue herons raising their young in the tops of some very tall trees which were right next to the biggest attraction of the reserve. Normally, the reserve had one stench, which was the foul odor of dead fish, which almost gaggingly strong when directly underneath the nests. This day, however, there were two foul odors. The dead fish scent was one which was older, more stale, and the second foul odor he noticed was one which was more animalistic than fishy. It was very noticeable anywhere else in the reserve besides under the heron nests. There it was subtle, but it was still noticeable. At some point in the distant past, the reserve had served as a rock quarry. The rock diggers had actually found the very end of what would turn out to be a huge area of quarry rock that would supply the cement and rock for the area for years to come and still currently is in operation. The men who started digging rock in the reserve dug out enough to create a nice little pond that has clear water, which is under 12-year-old because you could always see the fish. Oftentimes you couldn't get them to bite on your fishing line, but at least you knew where they were at so you could dangle your bait in front of them. And Jerry loved to just watch the fish. To his knowledge, the quarry lake only offered perch, bluegill, largemouth bass, and of course bullhead catfish. How the largemouth bass got in there was anybody's guess. The other fish arrived in ponds and waterways uninvited, but the largemouth bass you normally had to pay to have stocked in your lake. Perhaps someone had thrown a couple of them in there, and that was all it needed. Anytime he was in the game reserve, there was a feeling of being watched. Jerry always attributed it to the wildlife being so unbothered by human beings. For instance, one day he was sitting there fishing, and a snake came out wherever it had been hiding, and it came right up to him and stuck its tongue out, just checking him out. It was obvious to Jerry that the snake had never encountered a human before, and it was curious as to what he was all about. Sticking out the tongue meant it was smelling him. The white-tailed deer would definitely be watching if they chose to stay around, and sometimes they did. Other times they would throw their white tails up in the air and then take off as a herd. So the times when he felt like he was being watched, he just figured the deer were somewhere near, but he just hadn't seen them yet. He never attributed that feeling to having been caused by something sinister, or perhaps that isn't a fair word. He never attributed it to something he didn't expect to find in the reserve. Obviously, Jerry survived his encounter, or we would likely not know anything about it today, or at least not from his perspective. So to call the creature sinister is unfair, even if it seems like it might have had sinister endeavors. The day Jerry became aware there was something unusual in the game reserve, he happened to have his .22 rifle. It is impossible to say whether the rifle was the cause for him to become aware of the creature living there. However, Jerry and his friends had been fishing back in the reserve many, many times and always without incident. Now, as the name applies, not very many people hunt on the property known as the game reserve. In fact, as far as Jerry knew, only he and his friends hunted the property, and that was not very often because they didn't want to get caught hunting on property which was termed a game reserve. Fishing there, on the other hand, seemed like a much less offensive act. Plus, on top of everything else, the game reserve had houses which were within reach of a stray bullet. That meant hunting there involved being very careful about the angle of which you shot, not to mention the direction. 22 rifles are notorious for ricocheting, and they can travel up to 2 miles. Jerry had been taught gun safety and practiced it religiously. However, you could hunt in the reserve if you kept to the side of it that backed up to Jerry's farm, so hunting there wasn't out of the question. Jerry seldom asked his friends to go hunting in the reserve because he didn't trust them to be careful enough to not shoot in the direction of the houses. Even though they were likely out of distance, if the bullet was fired from the side of the reserve next to his farm, he didn't believe in taking chances. He did, however, trust his own judgment to know when and where it was safe to fire the weapon. He was sitting there on the edge of the water next to the pond when he thought he saw something dark move from one tree to the next. The area where he was looking was thick with trees, and their canopy made the area under them very dark, and a perfect place to hide something with dark fur. Jerry wasn't certain he had seen anything, yet he had that feeling of being watched, and it was strong, and he started to work his way toward the property line where he could cross back over to his father's farm. He left the area a little more spooked than usual. A couple weeks passed, and Jerry once again decided to go hunting in the game reserve. He crossed over the barbed wire fence into the reserve, and like always, it felt like he entered into another world. Understand, to even get to the reserve, he had to go to the very back of his father's farm. If you are familiar with how the gravel roads crisscross the Kansas east side, they are fairly standard in that they separate the countryside into huge squares. Jerry's farm took up half the distance of one of those squares. The other half was taken up by the reserve. So these were both properties which went deep into the countryside. Being on his father's property back there was a little spooky. It was nothing compared to when you crossed over into the reserve. The land also sits in a lower region where you can see on the horizon to the east and to the west a ridge, which means the area is somewhat cut off from the worst of the winds. Oftentimes, when the ponds on Jerry's farm were nearly whitecapping with waves caused by the wind, Jerry could travel over to the quarry pond in the reserve and literally have no wind at all. The fact that the land itself was nearly always calm made it stand out as a strange place even before you started throwing in the fact that there seemed to be something unknown living there. If you went further into the property, beyond the quarry pond, there were two places which human beings had obviously once inhabited. There was the remains of a house which had been burned down, leaving only the chimney which had been made from the local rocks. Accompanying the rock chimney was the rock wall, so that there was one end of the house still standing, and the rest of it was just charred remains. Investigating what was still standing revealed it had been a dirt floor home that whoever had built it had went to the trouble to landscape the place to an extent. There were trees which hugged the remains of the house, proving whoever built the house then planted the trees as a means of either hiding the building or perhaps to act as a wind shear, since the heaviest fauna was on the north side of the place. The place was well hidden, and you nearly had to be on top of it to find it. If you went even further beyond the remains of the home, you would discover the beginning of the Big Blue River, although it technically did not become that river officially for probably another 5 miles. The area had added spooky because it had long stretches of rocky ridges that had split apart, leaving an area about the size of your average road between each of the ridges. The ridges rose out of the ground about a height of 10 feet. They were just high enough that if you were walking in the area between them that you could not see what was on the other side of the ridge. This was an area which was under the canopy of tall trees, so it was always shaded. The temperature always seemed to be at least 10 degrees cooler in these areas. They were excellent growers of morel mushrooms in the spring, and even sometimes in the summer and fall there would be some morels to be found. Jerry decided to go see if there were any mushrooms. As he wandered through the valleys between the ridges, he thought he heard something moving on the other side, perhaps keeping pace with him. The ridges were inconsistent, and there would be places where you could cross over from one valley to the next. Remember, a valley was only about as wide as a road. Then there would be a rocky uprising, which usually had a fairly straight edge to it, meaning you couldn't just walk up on top of the ridge. It was almost as if a road crew had come in and cut the valleys out leaving straight up and down walls of about 10 feet in height. The soil in the valleys, which is where the mushrooms grow so well, is always usually very soft soil, which allows for very explicit footprints. Jerry passed between one of the ridges into the valley on its other side to see if there were any mushrooms in that area. He was shocked to see huge footprints had walked through the valley. Suddenly, Jerry, no longer like what was watching him was white-tailed deer or maybe a raccoon which had not went to bed on time. Suddenly, he felt like he might be in danger, and he remembered that animal which had been hiding in the shadows of the trees the last time he had been there hunting rabbits. You know when you remember something which is something you weren't able to see clearly and only for a brief second, that you can tend to leave out details which are actually there to be had. But because you had such a brief instant to gather in the data provided, that any of it which is odd or out of the narrative, for whatever the main part of the data provides, that your mind will edit it either out completely or it will make the information bend to meet the narrative because logic suggests that is the actual conclusion. In other words, when you see something for just a brief second, and it's in the darkness found under the thick canopy of a forest that had plenty of tree trunks large enough to hide even very large animals, you deduce that since the largest animals in your location are only white-tailed deer, maybe on the outside chance it could possibly be a mountain lion, though none had been seen in eastern Kansas in probably 150 years, your mind will shave down the data which your brain believes that you saw not only a very big animal moving in those shadows, but that it also was very, very tall. If your mind tells you that you saw something moving which was 8 feet tall in a forest where the likely tallest creature would be a big buck whitetail which might reach 6 feet tall if it had stumbled upon some radiation, then your mind might apply reason to the brief second you had to see that thing, and in the end whittle it down to a reasonable height which would then provide the reasonable explanation of what it was that you had seen. Which all works very neatly until you happen upon tracks which are human-like in appearance but considerably larger than that of any human being, including Shack, who might have a foot as long as the prints Jerry was seeing, but they certainly were not as wide, and his toes would not have fit the mold of the tracks he was looking at. They were incredibly deep, too. Whatever made the prints must have weighed 4 to 6 times as much as Jerry, based on the fact he was barely sinking into the soil, but the prints he was looking at were in some places maybe 4 inches deep embedded. The prints were headed back the way from which he had just come. Jerry wondered how fresh the tracks were. Had they been made that day? They surely did not appear to be extremely old. Jerry glanced over his shoulder back the way he had just come. He felt his pulse quicken and his breath increased. He had to come to terms with the very real possibility that he may have to travel back through the area where whatever it was that made those tracks was waiting. If he kept going in the same direction, he would come upon the second man-made dwelling which existed in the reserve. It was a log cabin which still stood and that had the last, or at least it had the last time Jerry was there, and it still had the capability of being locked up. He assumed the building was still standing. He wouldn't be surprised if nobody had been there since the last time he had been there, which was a year previous. The log cabin had a driveway of sorts, which if you followed it to the end, you would come to a place which was right next to where the river ran, cutting a gash into the landscape, which left the river just enough room for the driveway before the land jumped back up. The driveway was blocked from entering from the gravel road that went by there by a tall chain-link fence gate, which was probably 12 feet to the top of it. The drive where you entered off the gravel road was also heavy with gravel, giving it the appearance of being someplace which was well kept and possibly even checked randomly by a security force. But that was the extent of it. Jerry had been coming there since he was 10 years old, and he had never seen a human being in the reserve that wasn't there with him. He didn't expect there would be anybody at the log cabin now. Unfortunately, he was much closer to the cabin than he was to anywhere else, but in the end he decided going there would only in the end mean he had to move more ground to cover before he was able to get out of the reserve. And while he was thinking this over, he again heard noises like there might be something moving around on the other side of the ridge. It might have been 2 ridges over, but he thought that something was definitely moving about. Jerry cut back over to the valley he had walked up, and he began to go back the way he came. The walk back was uncomfortable because he didn't see any wildlife. There was no noise like usual. Even the buzzing of the insects was absent. Combine that with the lack of any sort of breeze or wind, and it was just incredibly spooky. When Jerry got back to the burned-out house with the wall and chimney made of rocks which were standing, he thought he noticed some things were out of place. Still, he couldn't be sure. And then he noticed that something had definitely been through the area after him, because there had been a rock which was sitting on top of another rock right in the middle of the burned remains of the house. He remembered it because he had went out of his way to not knock the rock off its strange perch, because it looked so strange and out of place. Now the rock was laying next to the rock it had been perched on. Despite looking not only right there where the rock was laying, but also all around it, he could not see any prints which would confirm the evidence. Jerry's pulse wasn't slowing down, though, that was for certain, and his breath felt like it was in a hurry to get in and out of his body. The heat of the day or nervousness, he wasn't sure, but he was sweating like a bookie at an IRS audit. Currently, he was in an open area, with the exception of the still standing rock wall and chimney and the trees which had grown along the side of the house remains. Jerry needed to go back into the thick forest in order to come out on the other side where the meadows would greet him on his way to the quarry pond. Then once he made it to the other end of the quarry pond, there were where the really tall trees were that the blue herons had their nests. Jerry looked over the forest he was going to have to go back through and thought he saw something moving in the shadows, and it might have been something very tall and very dark. And suddenly Jerry was not so keen about going back the way he had come in. There were a couple other ways to get back to his father's farm. They just involved going around instead of going straight through. The insects were still absent. Jerry went to go around the area where he had seen the large creature moving in the shadows between the trees. And if he had to guess, he would have said that the thing which he had tried to go around had moved with him, and that it was still somewhere very close. He could see the gravel road which ran along the side of the farm. It ran perpendicular to the property line he was needing to cross. There was a house at the end of that gravel road, and no place for cars to turn around. Most times they turned into the entrance to the back of his farm and used it to turn around. Despite being able to see the house at the end of the gravel road, Jerry was still a long ways from reaching his father's property. It wasn't a long ways in terms of distance. Probably only about 3 football fields separated him from his father's farm. The distance was what he had to go through to get there. It was a valley, or perhaps better described as a ditch, which caught the runoff from the land in both directions. As such, that part of the landscape was full of every kind of imaginable sticker bush and trash fauna the area had to offer. It also had many places something could be hiding in ambush. Jerry opted to backtrack and go back to the path he had originally followed to get into the reserve. It meant going back through the taller trees, which meant going through a darker area due to the tree canopy, and the darkness of the shade naturally seemed spooky. The logic in Jerry said he was much better off going back through this area than through that ditch of a valley. The tall trees were not a confusion of sticker bushes and Osage orange trees, which were also armed with sharp thorns. In fact, the Osage orange, which are sometimes known as hedge apple trees, have thorns which can go right through a person's sneaker, and they don't have too much trouble finding the way through work boots. Also, keeping company with those already mentioned were locust trees, which have the biggest, baddest thorns of all. If you got stuck by one, it would paralyze that part of the body, very similar to the way that Botox prevents a person from being able to smile if they get too much. So Jerry backtracked until he was back at the burned-out house. Once again he felt he had company follow him, but he was determined to get home. He had his .22 caliber rifle, and if he was forced to defend himself, then so be it. Of course, Jerry was aware his little rifle would not be much against a larger animal. Even a white-tailed buck would not go down if shot with the .22. Still, it was far more comfort than if he had shown up to go fishing and all he had was a fishing pole. And Jerry was getting tired. He was hungry, and despite being afraid, he still hadn't actually seen anything to be cause for him to be afraid. Seeing something moving in the shadows of the shade might have been something as simple as a bird. Perhaps 2 birds flew at the same time, causing an optical illusion which just looked like something really tall was moving around in the trees. Jerry fired his gun off once, just to let anything that might have been thinking of ambushing him to reconsider. He felt the shot proved he wasn't afraid to make some noise, and then he started his 3 football field length march toward his father's farm. He was upon the quarry pond in no time. Searching the surroundings, it all looked normal and quiet. The water was its usual calm demeanor. Jerry stepped out onto the rocky surface which surrounded the clear pool. He walked the distance of the quarry pond until he was at the end where the tall trees stood and the blue herons had their nests. The area still had a noticeable hint of dead fish, even though the birds had probably been gone for a month or longer. Now the nests were just empty reminders of what would be back the next year. Jerry slid underneath the tall trees and followed the little stream which fed the quarry pond whenever it rained enough to run off. This little stretch was an excellent place to run into a timber rattler or a copperhead snake. As much as he would have preferred to be watching the trees for anything hiding behind their trunks, this was an area which demanded his attention to stay focused on where he placed his feet. The last thing he wanted to do was to scare up a rattler and get bit while worrying about a perceived threat, instead of watching out for the very real threats that were just the wrong step away from becoming a very real danger requiring very real medical treatment. Finally, he could see the barbed wire fence that denoted the change from the reserve to his father's farm, his pulse still racing and his breath heaving in and out, half from the exercise and the other half from the fear of what was out there with him. He let himself fall in between the barbed wires until his body was on his father's side of the fence. This is where he parked his motorcycle. Quickly he jumped up and climbed on his bike. He kicked it started and then was able to relax enough to look back the direction from which he had escaped. There it stood, just back inside the cover of the shade from the forest. He could see it had dark fur or hair. The eyes were set back in that hair-covered face so far they seemed to be like tiny pools of black oil set in a landscape of slightly less dark hair, which hung down over the beast's eyes, giving it the look of a sheepdog that had its fur dyed black. Jerry sat there looking at it for probably 5 minutes while it looked back at him. He kept his motorcycle running the entire time. He had his rifle swung over his back at that point, but he wouldn't have tried a shot at the creature, even if the gun had been sitting in his lap. It wasn't the fact that the gun wouldn't have had the power to kill the creature, but rather that he felt he had been allowed to leave the reserve, not that he had escaped. It felt like he had been escorted, for lack of a better word, out of the area, and now his escort was standing there watching him to make sure he had made it out of the area. Perhaps he had been escorted out of the area to prevent him running into much worse circumstances that he had encountered. Maybe the creature was watching him, had hurried him along before its mate came along, who was much less forgiving of such intrusion. He couldn't guess. Still, he felt like he had been helped, not harassed. Jerry had other reasons to not fire upon the creature. They were the same reasons he never told anybody about what he had seen that day, with the exception of a few times when his friends, whom he had been back in the reserve with him hunting in the past, wanted to go back. He couldn't tell any adults about what he had seen because it would have been telling on himself for trespassing. The reserve had many, many signs hung on its fences on all 4 sides which announced no hunting and no trespassing. Jerry did, in fact, return to the reserve 2 years later when hunting with his friends. They experienced nothing extraordinary. It was the only time he ever returned to the reserve. Thank you for visiting. Please subscribe and like. It is appreciated. Godspeed to all.